The rules around medical cannabis are still brand new to a lot of Kentuckians.
Michael asked, I have a medical marijuana card and my apartment doesn't allow smoking or vaping. Can I be stopped from smoking inside even if I have a medical card? Here's our Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
Kentucky law says in general, property owners can limit the use of smoking or vaping, including medical cannabis, in or on their properties. Now, in the portion under employers not being required to permit medical cannabis, it also says that law shall not prohibit a person, employer, corporation, or any other entity who occupies, owns, or controls a property from prohibiting or otherwise regulating the use, consumption, possession, transfer, display, transportation, sale, or growing of medical cannabis in or on that property. There are protected classes that apply to renters. Those include factors like race, religion, sex, and age, but medical cannabis use does not fall under any of those. Kendra Still with the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services told me that Team Kentucky wants to make sure people with qualifying conditions have access to safe, quality medical cannabis, but she also told me that rules on vaping or smoking are governed by the terms of a tenant's lease. Quote, the Office of Medical Cannabis encourages cardholders to review the terms of their lease to identify any provisions related to use of medical cannabis in their leased space. If you have a good question, just email us. Good question at WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.